I've been alongside Pam part of the BERA STEAM Commission looking at the relationship between arts, creativity and science this year. And what I really particularly want to do using this particular project is to consider what kind of significance creativity might have in terms of reappraising the curriculum. That's my idea. I'm interested in the kind of discourses that creativity therefore gives us. So I'm going to try if I can to give you a really tiny insight into this project in order to have that discussion. So it's a project called the Imagineering Initiative. It's arguably, because of the term itself, a STEAM education model. And what it does is it involves children working with artists, engineers, as young Imagineers. So they're children aged 8 to 11, key stage 2. They work on a project in which they work alongside these artists, engineers, and designers and teachers, and their job is to create a kinetic performance structure. That's essentially what is the common thing across all the different projects that happen. As the term Imagineer perhaps suggests to you, it's a combination of the imagination and the engineering, and there's a series of dispositions around the artist and the makers that we communicate to them. And what they're doing during that is collaborating and exploring. So one of the projects, for example, that they were involved in is they were designing vehicles to be part of a city centre parade that represented their city, its values, its meaning, its sense of future. Another one they've done most recently is when they were designing the terrible tractors as part of Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox. Okay, so those are the kinds of things they've done, but what they're doing is imagining, designing, making, and presenting. So they start in this kind of rather imaginative way. There's a frame given to them in terms of sorry, I think something's gone wrong with that. In this particular example, you can see this mini cyclopedia that appeared in the playground for the children one morning, and these costumed Imagineers that were there. So they kind of got flying helmets, they're a bit like 19th century inventors. The machine's dressed up like a time machine. They turn up with maps, they're scouring these maps, they're behaving as if they're rather confused, looking for imaginative children, and that's the launch, the hook in. So there's always this kind of sort of imaginative, dramatic frame that happens to get things going. And there's novelty there, novelty in the attire, in the way they speak, the things that they're saying, and they're drawing the children in to explore and experience what it's like to be with them. So on this particular thing, you can see the suitcases that are there. Those suitcases had in them a series of clues that we use for children to uncover. They get given the commission directly. In this one, it came from the city councillors on a scroll. In the Fantastic Mr. Fox, it came from the artistic director. So it's being set up in quite a, an artistic sort of way. And what we're doing through that is trying to engage them in the interest of it, to get them interested in the concepts that are involved in being designers, in being artists, in being engineers, feeding their curiosity. And we do that by getting them to sort of witness certain things. So you can see on the right-hand side this 6-metre tall Godiva who was part of a big project, a big artistic project. When the children arrive at the Imaginarium, which is an industrial space, the first thing they see is the animated Godiva, who is this tall. So there's something about that scale which connects with kind of what Reggio Emilia talk about in terms of taking children to big piazza spaces, very tiny children, big spaces. The notion of your imagination going big, having those big visions, connecting with big ideas. Scale matters an awful lot. So that idea of kind of visualizing, sensing, physicalizing, those kinds of things are really important in what we're doing, getting them into the project. And then through the project, they also work very physically. The idea of working with their bodies is really important. So they're exploring here the issue of the way in which they create stable structures. They're exploring the ways in which weighting makes a difference in terms of stability, what kind of tensile and floppy structures do. And in finding those things out through their bodies, they're sensing something and coming to know it when they then go to do the making. They're exploring large-scale mechanisms that have been constructed for them to explore, to understand the way in which change and movement can happen within a structure. So there's a mixture here between the kind of like the very ordinary, the very kind of embodied, the awe-inspiring. All those things are happening, and they're doing that in teams. So being part of the BERA team has given us a real kind of awareness of the kind of different sorts of creativity, the different interpretations of creativity that we have. There's a regular debate amongst us, amongst the science and artists, about what kind of role the arts brings to creativity and what kind of creativity is innate in there. So there's an awful lot that comes from the creative STEM argument that suggests that there is creativity that is innate within the engineering, the maths, the technology itself, and the job of us to shift things in education is not necessarily about the arts, but it's about increasing the authenticity, building those connections more closely, being inspired by what real people do. So there's a kind of issue there about the interplay between what we mean. For example, the notion of experimentation. That term has been used and understood very differently across the different partners in our STEAM Commission. We think we mean the same things, but do we really? What are the frames? What are our processes and patterns? So those kind of things have been really interesting for us to explore, but certainly that idea of bringing things closer together and the significance of authenticity seems to be true across. And that's certainly there in terms of the work that we've been doing, we're doing in the Imaginarium. So the other thing that the children do then is to focus upon making, and you can see this here. So in one of the images there, you've got one of the engineers who works as an Imagineer on the project here, working very closely alongside children. And here another child who kind of is taking what he's seen happen and doing exactly the same thing on his own. Children negotiating here with other adults and taking over the drive of the way things go. Also just playing with materials and exploring what kinds of effects things have. So there's very much something very exploratory about that. So that's kind of, really where I am now with the project itself, and I want to kind of draw things out from that. So the things we've been talking about is this idea of connecting, the connection between the mind and the body, the connection across disciplines, children being engaged in looking at bigger, universal questions, the relationship of idea to practice. Those are the kinds of things that seem to be really important in the work that we've been doing, and the work that is also there in the literature that's currently out there in terms of STEAM education. And this idea of the journey from an idea into reality that young people don't typically engage with. They do fragments of it, they never do the whole thing. It never goes into the real world. So, the ways in which education can move itself into that closer proximity is really important. But also the significance of the relational, of where the child is in relation to the learning, how that builds a kind of sense of self-belief. So the sociality of the context is really important. So it positions STEM learning as being significant to oneself, imaginatively and personally. And from the research, what's been really interesting is this kind of constant reiteration that comes through these kinds of experiences of children reconceiving of themselves, seeing themselves as being capable, of being ready to have a go, as having resilience, as having different world views, of seeing the messages that come from society as needing to be looked at critically. So these are just some little examples there, but those are the kinds of things that have come out. So I've done a little bit of kind of grounded theorising then, using the Imagineering in the context of this, and looked particularly at the kinds of conditions for creativity that seem to be important, and the kinds of creative practices that come. And I'm guessing that across the room there may be some of you who will recognise those very naturally, some of you who may see from more of a science perspective that those things are natural to you, regardless of whether you are, whether you see the arts as being significant or not. You may see this as something that belongs entirely to creative STEM, not necessarily STEAM, that there isn't necessarily a dimension of that there. But I think probably what I'm really interested in is trying to kind of advance that. I'm interested in the human conditions for creativity, and that's what we're picking up from the literature, where the innovations are happening, and also in projects like the Imagineering, is that there is something about the way in which the arts bring a particular dimension about values, about the sociality. We've talked a lot about space and interconnections today. And that's something that I think is really important, is there's something to be learned in that collaborative way of being together. So to begin to review then, what do creative practices offer to us here? What's the significance of creativity cited in the arts as opposed to in the sciences? Is it a little bit like in the Imagineering project, a kind of STEM by stealth? When the children arrived, for example, at the Imagineering, and they found this kind of rather grey, hard building, there was a bit of, kind of like this wasn't what we were expecting. They walk through the door, they meet Godiva, they see all the arts, and suddenly the world changes. And at the end of the project, a lot of them talked about it as not being a sciencey project. But then when we talked about the science they learned, they were very clear they learned science, but they weren't calling it science. It didn't feel like science. It felt arty. Is that a success or is that a failure? If one of our aims is to produce scientifically literate artists and artistically literate scientists, then surely we need them to be self-aware of that. We don't want it to be hidden. So is it a problem or is it not? There's also something about being situated and making as if professional artists, using the science and technology as practiced by the engineers. That's something that seems to come out of that positioning as if. And the other thing is that the arts-based creativity has already been suggested today by Roz. It reveals some kind of permeability or hybridity. Thompson and Pat Thompson's work reveals this in terms of the signature pedagogies. I've looked at it before in this notion of invited disturbance. There's a kind of negotiated relationship that happens between professional and the educational arts. When schools invite this kind of work in, they're kind of saying, we know things get regular, we know it has to be disturbed a bit, let's do it again, shall we? So that kind of, grit in the oyster moves things on a little bit. So, does creativity and STEM therefore get us to STEAM? I just want to refer back now a little bit just into the context of the commission, which is just this idea that we have to remember the context in schools. Educational research echoes this. We have curriculum silos. We have maths up there. We have science nearly up there. We have technology. And we have engineering hidden somewhere in science. So they're not necessarily visible, and if they are, they're in that kind of separate silo. So the literature, the research literature, tends to be in that fragmented way, related to the hierarchy and that global competition that we have. There's also an issue about the currency. Who uses the word STEM and STEAM? How familiar are they in terms of ways of working? And one of the articles from Yakman talks very much about the ways in which the STEAM, STEAM education has two different models: things working in complement and things working in integration. So is the issue for us then that creative pedagogy is simply a way of bringing novelty and fun in, or so is it all hot air, this notion of STEAM, or is there something that creativity can revision? So just to conclude, what can it do? I'm suggesting that STEAM, creativity through STEAM, can point up a role for the arts. We have a lot of conversation about today. If the arts are languages, what kind of new languages do they give? They expand our ways of knowing. They emphasise the senses. There's a lot of literature at the moment that talks towards a turn towards the effect, a turn towards the significance of the body. The idea of creativity being dynamic with intelligence, the literature on intelligence and creativity, whosever lens you look it up, whether they are overlapping or whether one's a subset of the other, they all talk about it as a site of interaction. We had that this morning from Jenny, again talking from the psychological, the Dietrich point of view, again something that's a point of intersection, interaction. And is it a way of therefore resisting a kind of reductionist curriculum? Biesta talks about the fact that we have to in some ways reduce the curriculum. But is this a way of kind of reducing that and saying, learning is complex, it is messy. Let's look at what holistic and interactive, let's draw upon that complexity literature and look at what kind of emergent pedagogies we can have. So to conclude then, if creativity is manifested in STEAM as a site for reappraising the curriculum, is it because it offers us learning as being more embodied, interactive, and the creative pedagogies emphasising that as a process and therefore pointing towards alternative conceptions of the curriculum as being emergent, as recognising that it is complex? And is it possible that creativity is the site in which you can do that through the STEM agenda? Okay.